Aldous Huxley and JFK and Lewis all died on the same day.
It's Illuminati.
Yep.
It was Murdoch.
Yeah. Yes. Walter.
One of the
Murdoch.
Murdochs. I was curious to talk about, so I was reading some of the essays from Abolition of Man. I believe it's it starts off, correct me if I'm wrong, there's a thing about the waterfall.
Mm-hmm.
And the education people, this is the dumb way of explaining this. The education smart people that wrote this textbook that he's criticizing were saying that the idea of beauty in the waterfall is not a real thing. It's a thing that is perceived by the viewer of the waterfall. And he's criticizing that, saying that beauty must be a real thing.
Yep.
And so why does he go to, instead of going to morality, right and wrong, natural law, why does he go to beauty, which feels so subjective? But at the same time, it is powerful because there are things that seem objectively beautiful.
Right. Yeah, I think it's all connected for Lewis. It's not just about morality. This idea of objective standards would apply to music, it would apply to art, and it has consequences for all. It applies to architecture. It would have consequences for all of those things if we reject the idea of any standards. And then his example there is, you look at a waterfall, you say that it's sublime or that it's beautiful. What does that mean? And the authors of this textbook that he's criticizing are telling the students that if you're really thinking clearly, what you're actually saying is that it makes me feel a certain way. I'm not actually saying anything about the waterfall. It's not about the object, it's about the subject. It's all subjective. But if we think that, if everything's just subjective, then there's just no difference. And the interesting thing about The Abolition of Man for me is that Lewis reads that in this educational textbook for really high school students in England. And he devotes 3 of his lectures for these endowed lectures at the University of Durham to trying to take down this textbook. But he's it's kind
of a mundane statement they make in the textbook, what they probably take for granted. They're just
they're probably not thinking too much of it.
Yeah.
And he's a gentleman enough that he doesn't want to name the authors. So he gives them pseudonyms in the book, and he just calls it the Green Book. He doesn't even say what book he's criticizing because he's trying to not ruin their careers and all that. When I was doing research for this book, I put in an interlibrary loan request for this book that he called the Green Book. It's actually called The Control of Language. And so it's
exposed.
But
you're going to get
cancel the authors.
I know, but it came in and it's green. It was like the dust jacket had been taken off a long time ago. It was just a green book that came in, which is what he calls it. And interesting side note, it was the foreword for the book was written by Rupert Murdoch's great uncle. I don't know if that means anything, but these guys. So his name,
I made a noise.
The Illuminati.
Yeah, I don't know. So he's Walter Murdoch, who was Rupert Murdoch's great uncle, is a professor of English from Australia or whatever.
Interesting.
Writes the foreword, and then so Lewis has this book. He's criticizing the way they teach students to think about the English language, and then he connects that to politics at the end. This is where all these things end up connecting. So he's talking about, what do you say when you say a waterfall is beautiful? What do you mean by that? And then at the end of the day, it's also going to be, what do you mean when you say something's just or unjust? Are you just saying, I don't like that? That makes me feel bad? Are you just describing your own feelings?
I don't like the Holocaust.
Yes, right.
I find it disagreeable.
Hitler gives me cold pricklies.
Right. And if that's what we're saying, where does that leave us? And I think that's what Lewis foresaw. He said, for a while there, we might live in a culture that had been conditioned and was living on the fumes of Christianity. So we kind of have these vaguely Christian ideas that we should protect the weak and we should care for the poor and we shouldn't just glorify violence and we shouldn't just think that the strong should rule. But is that just because those things kind of make us feel good? Or is it because there's something objectively true about them? And if there's nothing true, what happens when we feel a different way? Or what happens generations from now when we have different ideas about these things? So that was always his worry, and I think that's a concern that we see today and could still think about.
So Lewis would say that there's art that's objectively beautiful.
Yeah. Yep.
So like classical music versus rapcore.
Yeah.
Like he would say that classical music, well, maybe, is beautiful.
He didn't get to hear rapcore.
I assume he would. I don't know.
Well, when did he die? What year did he die?
He died in 63, the same day as
probably
JFK.
Wouldn't hit rapcore.
Yeah, he got overshadowed pretty big.
And Huxley died that day too. So Walter
One of the Murdochs.
Yes. So he would have thought that. I don't know what he thought about rap music or what he would have thought about rap. I kind of have some idea. He probably wouldn't have loved it. But But he did think there would be objective standards. So it's not like all music is subjective. It's just whatever you like. That there would be something built into the structure of reality about melody and about notes and about how things come together. That would mean that even if you found pleasure in and you liked listening to pots and pans bang together, that was somehow pleasing to you, it would tell you that there's something wrong with you. That
People who like Limp Bizkit. Something wrong.
That
Corrupted.
That it wouldn't. It's not all subjective. It doesn't mean that you have rightly ordered desires or that you appreciate. So you could not appreciate beauty, or you could not appreciate good music or whatever it is, but there would be actual standards to judge those things, that it's not all subjective. And I think this kind of philosophy of subjectivism starts creeping into every discipline. And Lewis he saw that. He was in the academic world. But if it starts creeping into standards of art, then you get abstract art. I always think it's fascinating if you go to an art museum and below the placard who tells you the artist and the year and whatever, a lot of times it will tell you the philosophy that influenced the art. And you see certain kinds of philosophy. And in this postmodern, there is no truth kind of philosophy, the art makes no sense. There's not proportionality and there's not certain angles. And it's just kind of, it all becomes abstract. And then it's hard to say what's art and what's not art and all that.
This picture of all these grizzly bears launching on rockets.
They're
art
probably
or not art?
They're probably different objective standards for how to evaluate satire. Satire has its own eternal standards to judge a good satire. Actually, there's probably some truth to that. So if Lewis was thinking about comedy and whether is there objective standards for what makes something fun? Is there any such thing as objectively funny? Where what is comedy? Is comedy a kind of teasing on the truth, where you're actually uncovering and unpacking things that are true, but doing it in this kind of way that looks at it from a different angle and does it in a way that sparks humor? And are there certain things that we would say, like, that's just not funny? You don't joke about that's objectively not a funny joke. And there might be something there. I was listening to this comedian on Netflix the other day. He was telling atheist jokes. And at the end of the joke, it was always about, should you be grateful to God if you get a good prognosis? And the whole joke was, no, you should be thanking your doctor, and God had nothing to do with it. And I remember thinking, well, it didn't seem objectively funny to me. But then the funny part that he had, and made me appreciate American culture, was he's a Scottish comedian. And he's performing in Ohio, and he says, after he tells this atheist joke, that a guy in the front row lifts up his shirt and shows him his gun, and he looks at him and he's kind of worried about it. And then another guy stands up and he says, "You're in America. You've got a First Amendment right to speak your mind. I don't appreciate your joke, but if that guy shoots you, I'll shoot him."
Patrick is the measure of what's objectively funny.
Yeah.
He's the laugh-o-meter.
Patrick laughs,
Right.
then it's objectively funny.
You've hit it right.
Eternally funny.
Yeah. Do you run the articles by Patrick first?
Yeah, we just present them to him. He sits on his throne. And
If he laughs, it's
if
good.
he laughs, then
If not, it goes into
He shakes around like a muppet.
roll around the floor.
So what about the very sciencey argument that we can find our morality because of oxytocin? It bubbles up, and then when we're doing right, and then it bubbles down when we're doing wrong, or something like that.
I don't know.
I heard a speech about
Just
that.
chemicals, man.
It's just the chemicals.
It's all chemicals. I don't know how you could follow that logic, because what happens when you get that dopamine hit from doing things that are, well, I guess maybe that's just how you know. But you really some people find, masochists or whoever, they find great pleasure in inflicting pain or being cruel.
Yeah, like the moment you find somebody who gets that little rush of dopamine from a bad thing.
That can't be, torturing puppies and enjoying it can't be the objective measure of whether that's right or wrong. Mm-hmm. And I don't think any serious person would say that.
Yeah. I think there are some serious people.
Maybe they say that.
They need something besides God to...
Yeah.
They're objectively stupid.
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. One, is there an objective standard? Two, how do you find out what it is? And, could you substitute for this idea of reason something else? The challenge with the natural law tradition has always been that people disagree about justice. And so it's at once the challenge, but it's also the motivating factor. So the very fact that we disagree about justice is precisely the reason why we have this quest for justice and why we want to understand what the true standard is and why we want to engage in this analysis. But the fact that everybody disagrees about it is also what makes us skeptical that there is any such true standard. You know, everybody disagrees. But mere disagreement can't be the thing that means there is no justice. Because if I register my disagreement with your disagreement, that doesn't just negate the whole thing. There has to be an answer. But it does become hard. And for Lewis, this was the role of education. He thought that not only do individuals have access to knowledge of the natural law, but they also have to be taught in the same way that there's a true answer in math. There's an objective mathematics, but it doesn't mean everybody knows how to do math. You still have to be taught math. And so there was a tradition of moral education and moral formation that had to take place. Mm-hmm. And he talks about that in The Abolition of Man as men transmitting manhood to men, as he says. And he's using that inclusive of women, of course, as well, but it's humanity transmitting humanity, and doing it through this kind of moral education. But it was that moral education always presumed that there was some standard that we were trying to shape students to truly be courageous, because courage is a real virtue, or that courage is a real virtue, that it's not just all arbitrary, that cruelty is not equal to charity or something like that.
Hey everybody, Kyle here from the Babylon Bee. I hope you really enjoyed that video. If you did, head on over to our YouTube channel, because there's a lot more where that came from. We do animation, funny sketches, we have a weekly podcast, we interview a lot of crazy and fun people. So go check it out, hit subscribe, like, share, comment, interact with us on social, because we feed on your love. And we might even reply and interact with you back. So check it out. Thanks a lot for watching.